This is the ExitUS podcast, and today we are so lucky to have with us an expert on fascism. It's not a happy topic. It's unbelievable, really, that we're talking about this in the context of America, and yet here we are. We are facing a very dangerous future, folks, and it is crucial that we not have our head in the sand, that we face with open eyes just how dangerous things are about to get. For me, this is the core reason why it's important to think about moving abroad, or if you can or you're not ready to prepare yourself for how to protect yourself and survive this very precarious future that we're facing. We're lucky to have an expert on fascism joining us, and I think it's an important discussion. I know it's one that made a big impact on me. I actually got sick after recording this episode. It, was too much for my immune system to handle. What can I say? But I really think, we need to face these facts and face up to what this future looks like. So I just want to say, take a moment, please, to subscribe to the podcast, either on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, and give us a review, give us a like, and share it with a friend or someone you know who's also trying to figure out how to navigate these perilous times. We are new. We want to make sure we get the word out and reach as many people as possible. So thanks so much, and without any further ado, let's jump into the discussion. This is the ExitUS podcast. I'm David Murphy, and today we're so delighted to have with us Craig Johnson, the author of the upcoming book, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism, and the host of 15 Minutes of Fascism, the podcast that looks at various aspects in 15-minute chunks of this very important topic. He studied right-wing movements around the world, and today, unfortunately, his expertise is so relevant here at home. So, Craig, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. I wish I could say it's a pleasure to talk about this, but, it's important, I guess.
It's important. I mean, to me, the analogy I like to use is sort of the sense that there's lava flowing in, and one really needs to prepare for the impact or lest one get burned. And I think...
Even before the pandemic, my metaphor was always like, imagine somebody who studies an extremely deadly disease. They might be really fascinated about it. They might have a bunch of stuff that they want to tell you about it, but it doesn't mean that they like it.
Well, we all know how Americans, faced the pandemic with a certain sense of denial, and that proved deadly for certain folks. I think, as we see the warnings here we've been seeing for a long time, they certainly didn't ring true, certainly for a lot of voters. But for the rest of us who, may have a sense that fascism actually is bad, it's dangerous, people may not quite know just how bad it can be. I mean, talking with people, even in my own friend circle, there's a sense that, well, hopefully, things won't be that bad, and hopefully there'll still be, checks and balances and everything. And I just realized I was very fortunate to grow up with a father who worked for the State Department and USAID on rule of law issues and advising developing countries. We were in Kenya, where the dictator, President Moi, had his picture on the wall in every establishment you'd go into. Post-Soviet Bulgaria, just in 1992, where you'd hear stories of how people were afraid of their own family members who, would potentially have reported them to the government if they were not loyal, and you couldn't even talk with loved ones about politics and things critical of the government. Spent time in Ukraine, and I just think for many people who, even if they're highly educated on all the issues of the day, it's just so easy to have your head in the sand as a method of coping, or, be in denial here. And I just think it's so important for our listeners as we face, we're recording this less than 2 months out from the January 20th change of government here, to really prepare for what actually one might expect, and what the risks are, and and be able to make the decisions to protect oneself as a result. So I really appreciate you making time for, I think a very important discussion here. And just off the top, give us a sense, and we'll want to have people, of course, check out your book. It's, I'm going to go into this a lot more detail coming March 10th, how to talk to your son about fascism. Very important angle, given the fact that young men are particularly susceptible to being pulled in to the fascist world. But talk to all of us here. Just off the top, what is fascism?
Yeah, so that's a really good and important place to start because lots of folks are unfamiliar with exactly what the term means and what it really signifies. Usually when people say the word fascist, they mean it as an insult, right? It's sort of like an empty word. It just means somebody I disagree with, like really strongly, right? Fascism is a political movement. It's a political movement on the right wing. It is fundamentally a grassroots movement. It's not something that can be imposed from the top down. It has to come from the bottom up. It typically believes in a strong man, the power of a particular leader. That particular leader is usually identified as being like a really virile, powerful man, even if they are very obviously physically not. Adolf Hitler was obviously not a very well person in terms of his health. He was very sickly, but that didn't matter, right? That's not how fascism works. Other important features of fascism is that it's inherently sexist. There have been female fascists and there have been female-led fascist groups, but they're few and far between. Fascism is male supremacist. Fascism is not necessarily racist, although almost all instances of fascism have been racist. There are a few fascist groups in Latin America, which is where my primary research is located, that were not overtly white supremacist, although in practice they're often white supremacist. Fascism is usually anti-Semitic, like almost to a rule, but not necessarily. The Italian Fascist Party, for example, had Jewish members before they allied with the Nazis later on in the 1930s. But yeah, that's a pretty good gloss. It's a right-wing political movement, usually a strong man. It's male supremacist. It's usually racist. And the big thing that I missed so far, and this is presumably why we're here talking about this, is that fascism, unlike almost all other political movements in the modern world, refuses to play by the rules, ever. Fascism will seek electoral power, but if that doesn't work, it is very willing, and not just willing, but happy to resort to violence. Fascists are not just violent because they think it might be useful to them sometimes. They believe that violence is good. They believe that violence is good for societies that experience violence. And they believe that violence is good for the people who participate in violence. They think that it makes powerful new men for, the new age that they want to build.
Horrible stuff. So bringing it home here, I mean, you've been able to study in great depth through, getting your PhD and all this stuff and studying right-wing, politics in other countries. What does it mean here? I mean, it can happen here. It is happening here. It feels like. Just how bad can folks expect things to be?
Yeah. That's a question that, no surprise, I've been getting that since election night from friends and family, from colleagues, from other folks out in the media world. I like to think that we can imagine two scenarios here. One scenario is the best we can hope for, which is to say something worse than Trump 2016, where Trump uses right-wing paramilitary organizations in order to attack leftists and progressive people, where he cracks down on LGBTQ people and organizations, where he enacts racist deportation policies, and where his economic policies tank the United States economy. So 2016, but worse, considering that all the checks and balances that stopped him last time have largely been eroded. That is unfortunately the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is something that the United States has not seen ever, really. Or maybe the comparable situation would be right before the Civil War. The worst case scenario is Donald Trump brings the United States military into all the major cities in the United States in order to conduct political and immigrant crackdowns. That the military goes door to door in order to find undocumented people killing thousands of people in the process, that the government uses the IRS and other government agencies in order to shut down nonprofits that are critical of the government, that the United States government turns its force against the Democratic Party, rendering it unable to contest any future election, that the government begins to imprison people who speak out against it, or at least that it monitors them to a much greater degree than it already does, considering that, of course, the United States government monitors dissenters. Every government does that. Another feature of this worst case scenario would be the extreme right wing paramilitary groups, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, Patriot Front, people like that, not just being emboldened by Donald Trump's victory, but being a part of his plan. They were part of his plan on January 6th. They were the army that stormed the Capitol to stage his coup. But it's possible that in the second administration, we're going to see something a little bit more like what we've seen in other countries, particularly in Latin America, where when there's a job that even the state security forces doesn't want to do because it's too dirty or too obviously violent or partisan, that they get essentially truckloads of guys in ski masks to go do it. We could see political disappearances, politically motivated killings and violence, kidnapping, all sorts of things like that. Things that, again, the United States hasn't seen essentially in like a mass way since the 1960s, and even really we're going back to like the 1850s to look at like how violent this could be in the United States. The comparable situation, if you know anybody who grew up in the dirty war in Argentina or under Pinochet in Chile, those are the cases that I think we should be looking to as the worst case scenario.
It's sobering indeed. I really thought you had a prescient post on Blue Sky asking folks, how are you preparing for your organizations, but I'd say, for yourself, for what this will look like. People can't just, hunker down and hope for the best, when the potential of what could happen is so dangerous. Do you think people are waking up to just how bad it could be, or do you think folks are just in denial?
I think it's a spectrum, and I think that we're all on that spectrum day to day, hour to hour,
Yeah.
You can still go out and get a cup of coffee, you can still apply for jobs, you can still hop on a plane and see your family for Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, like all of those things still work. And the fact is that even in the worst case scenario, those things will still work. I think that that's something that a lot of people are going to have a hard time wrapping their head around, is that even in the worst case scenario, for most people, something like everyday life will continue. It's just that for the most vulnerable and for the people who speak out against Trump, everyday life will be impossible. But the question is, how many people are willing to risk the lives and safety and freedom of other people for their own perceived security or for their own perceived safety?
So, I see personally a spectrum of options for people. One is learning how to, live under a fascist government as an American, who maybe previously was very active in politics and an activist and out on the streets protesting. But, just realizing that may not be an option if one wants to avoid threats to one's personal safety. So, you can sort of have your head down and learn from people in other countries who just go about their lives in a less political way. Another option, the subject of this podcast, personally, I think is, a worthwhile goal to pursue is, exiting the U.S., moving to higher ground where you can still be that fully active political person, and in a more democratic country with broader protections. But, what to you are the spectrum of options? And of course, being that brave person who stays here in the U.S. and fights, for rights for everyone, that's so important. Talk us through about what you see as the spectrum of responses to this threat.
Yeah. I mean, like you said, you can stay and fight. You can leave and continue to fight. You can stay and try to survive. All of those are perfectly reasonable things to do in the face of danger like this. What I usually say to people is, just like they tell you on the plane and security announcement, you have to put your mask on first. If you are not safe and if your community isn't safe, then you need to focus on that. Focus on your own safety. Keep yourself and your community safe, alive, functioning. If that's impossible for you to do in the United States, and for a lot of people it might be, if you're a politically active person, there might be challenges ahead for that. If you are queer, especially if you are trans, there will be serious challenges ahead in staying in the United States. If you are an undocumented immigrant to the United States, there will be serious challenges to being in the United States. This is especially unfortunate for undocumented immigrants because many of them came here under duress because they were fleeing other politically oppressive regimes, or they were fleeing violence in a home country, or pursuing some sort of economic dream or hope. It's something that everyone is going to have to grapple with. Leaving the United States obviously carries its own challenges. Again, going back to these sort of like two ends of the spectrum here, best case scenario, worst case scenario, probably we're going to get something in the middle, right? Something that's some combination of these things. In the best case scenario world, the administration doesn't try to stop anybody from leaving. In the worst case scenario world, the United States government could suspend visa protections to US citizens traveling to Europe. I mean, they could. And then it would be up to European states or any other states where US citizens were arriving to determine if they were going to grant them refugee status, which is something that, as far as I'm aware of, has not happened to a citizen of the United States, with the exception, I guess, of some dissidents like going to Cuba or North Korea or Soviet Union or something like that. But that could be where we are. In the places that I study, that I did my dissertation research on, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, when dissidents left those countries during the dictatorship, a lot of them went to Mexico, a lot of them went to Paris, a lot of them came to the United States, Canada, other places in Europe other than Paris, but a lot of them ended up in Paris. That was dependent on those governments choosing to allow those people to enter. It's a complicated question.
Indeed. Well, let's get back to the U.S. And looking at what we can expect here. For many of us, we learned as a kid, checks and balances. There's a balance of power. The Fourth Estate will help keep things in check. But the reality is here, the House, the Senate, the executive branch, and the Supreme Court are all very much aligned with Trump. And we're seeing the Jeff Bezoses of the world, others in the press, aligning with ways to not stick their neck out and protect themselves. And there's a sense that a lot of these checks and balances from the media may not be there as much, or frankly we've seen they already don't work necessarily. We know what's happening, but there's no shame. Do you see it just being unrealistic for people to fall back on that sense that, we're protected by these checks and balances? I think it's easy for people to want to be in denial and to say, it can't really be that bad.
Yeah, certainly the protections that have prevented most US presidents from doing sort of whatever they want are gone now. This doesn't mean that Donald Trump has completely free reign, right? There are members of his coalition that don't exactly go along with literally everything that he says and wants. But we don't know how long that will last. Everything that is in his platform, everything that he has said that he wants to do, mass deportations, tariffs, cracking down on dissidents, potentially prosecuting and imprisoning his political opponents, including up to and including former president, or soon to be former president, Joe Biden. Those are all on the table. Those could easily happen. Even with the Democrats in power in part of Congress, a bill is being passed that would allow the United States to designate any nonprofit organization a terrorist organization. That is with regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and wherever you land on that issue, you better believe that that piece of legislation is going to be used outside of the purview of that conflict by the United States government, by a Trump administration. So yeah, I think that the gloves are off, like for real. It's entirely possible that a Trump administration would look a lot more like the presidential dictatorships that you describe having seen in Kenya, in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain. That is what we're talking about here. The checks and balances that stopped Trump last time have every chance of failing or having already failed.
So what does that mean, for individuals and for organizations? What should they be doing?
Yeah. So for individuals, you should be, like I said, focusing on your own safety, survival, functioning. If you work for the United States government, you need to prepare to not have a job in December or February. If you work in education, you need to be prepared to be out of work. If your business or nonprofit requires any funding from the United States federal government in order to function, your organization needs to be prepared to lose that money immediately. Here we are rooting for we are unfortunately rooting for the questionable competence of a lot of Trump's cabinet picks here, because if they were efficient administrators, then they would be cutting this money a lot earlier, right? But it's entirely possible that they won't be doing that. That's what you need to be preparing for at the very least. Being out of work, your organization losing funding. If you work for an organization that's critical of the administration or that has been in the past, you need to be prepared for legal action coming against you personally and coming against your organization as a whole. You need to be prepared for not being able to fight back in the ways that you would have before, especially if you live in a place where the court has already been filled with Trump appointees. That depends on where you are. That is one of the other things. That's one of the things here, which is different about the United States compared to almost every other case where we've seen something like this before. The United States is a federal system. So there are going to be places where it will work differently, right? The Bay Area, Chicago, Denver, possibly New York City, although Eric Adams has long been a friend of Donald Trump, so who knows? These places, have decided that they are going to oppose the Trump administration and its plans, at least in some capacity. But we don't know how much. And the fact is that federal courts trump state courts, federal courts trump local courts. This is one of those unfortunate instances where the verb trump comes up when you're talking about the man.
But it's all the more true here.
Yes, yeah.
Frankly, Trump's rule of law, we're seeing, people can't even expect that we'll only necessarily have 4 years of this, right?
No. Trump has already joked about running again. I have already seen some suggestions that some Republicans will argue that the amendment that limits a president to 2 terms is about 2 consecutive terms, which is a trick that was pulled in Russia and then in various other presidential dictatorships before. And so that would not be a big surprise.
So this is all very sobering. What, if anything, have you learned from your studies of how average citizens have, survived mentally, mental health? How have people, let's say you don't have the resources to move to higher ground, and you're stuck living in this environment. I mean, it's a huge shock. It takes a lot of time to process and deal with. How have people built meaningful lives that are worthwhile, even in the midst of a fascist authoritarian government system? Have you seen lessons, from other countries on that?
There definitely are. And again, it depends on your own risk profile. If you are the sort of person who believes that it makes sense for you to be out there fighting, a lot of people find a lot of value and meaning and will to continue in that. If you are the sort of person who finds value and meaning in fighting clandestinely, then that's a possibility as well. There will be a rich world of online activism and of, trying to get messages out, and trying to spread the word, trying to fight disinformation. There's also a big important role in terms of keeping communities functioning. Literally, a lot of people, especially if Trump continues with his plans to cut a lot of government funding to welfare programs, a lot of people will just literally need help in order to survive in the United States. And not only is that good work to do, it will also make you feel better about your life. Helping people is good for you, it's good for everybody. And so that's a way that a lot of people have found meaning. Some people turn to faith traditions in this, a long history of guiding people through times of hardship. And for all we've talked about not ignoring problems, but needing to turn your brain off to them sometimes, that's true. You can't think about this constantly. If you are privileged enough to have moments of respite, take them. You do, in fact, need to keep living, keep surviving, go dancing, have birthday cake, like you need to keep living to the extent that you're able and keep fighting for the people who can't.
Amen. We all need to figure out how to be resilient here. So, Craig, I am so grateful to you for your time. I want to point people to your podcast again, 15 Minutes of Fascism, wherever you get your podcasts. Check it out. And also invite people to pre-order your book, which is coming out March 10th, and looks at how to talk to your son about fascism. So really appreciate the fact that you are a guiding light for the rest of us here in facing facts here and in figuring out how to deal with these brave new times. So, Craig, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was, like I said, I wish I could say it was a pleasure to talk about this, but it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.